Hey, how's it going? Today I'm going to be reviewing The Apostle, directed by Gareth Evans, starring Dan Stevens. It's a horror film set in the early 1900s. As I've mentioned before, I'm a huge fan of horror films, so I was pretty excited to see this movie. I knew watching the trailer alone that it was going to be somewhat of an artsy kind of horror film, kind of like The Witch, which is fine because I absolutely loved The Witch. I thought that was a fantastic movie. And I have to think that director Gareth Evans had to draw some type of inspiration from that because their movies are somewhat similar in their tone. And spoiler alert, even though he hasn't directed much horror, I still absolutely loved this movie. The story begins with our main character Thomas, who's been sent to a remote island in order to save his kidnapped sister, who was taken by a cult. He pretends to be a convert and begins his path of finding out where his sister is and how he's going to get her out of there. From the beginning, I loved the cinematography. They did a great job with the camera work that do well to give a certain feeling of dread. There are also some beautiful shots. It was filmed in Wales after all, which has some truly amazing places to film. On top of the cinematography, the sound is also great. The music had this kind of tribal, thumpy, simple music. It was just this very slow thumping that occasionally built up faster, and sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it slowed down, sometimes it sped up, and it built this very strong tension throughout the entire movie because this sound plays pretty much throughout the entire movie. Horror movies tend to fall apart when it comes to the story. Horror films come a dime a dozen, much like superhero movies today. While those continue to be entertaining, even if they aren't that great of a story, I'm looking at you, Ant-Man. A horror movie with a bad story is just a bad movie. The Apostle, however, has a great story. The horror elements are built with tension rather than jump scares. I don't believe there's a true jump scare in the entire 129-minute runtime, except for maybe one little scene, but it didn't last very long at all, and it was a very small, minor jump scare. I'm a fan of jump scares, especially when they're done right, when there's a proper build up and they're executed the way that they should be, which is not all over the place. But I have no complaints because the movie did tension in all the other way. There are scenes where there are things going on. There's this random lady that appears and you don't know exactly why. The film's not giving you any explanation, but nothing happens with it. That's a perfect way of building tension without using jump scares. You honestly don't even know if what's happening is real or not. I definitely commend this film for not going the modern horror trope of just throwing jump scares everywhere. I also have to give props for the acting. Dan Stevens brilliantly plays Thomas, the brother of the kidnapped sister. You can tell from the beginning of the film that he hasn't had a particularly good life and he's having a hard time keeping things together. All of the other characters were great performances and I didn't have any issues with anything in particular when it came to the acting. Alright, so from here on there's some minor spoilers but nothing too crazy. Outside of the acting, there's a few things I have some issues with. There's a scene where Jennifer has been taken to the center of the village to be tormented and ridiculed, and there's kids around her poking her with sticks, and she hasn't eaten in days. She looks awful. And then all of a sudden this girl comes and she shoos them all away and she gives her some food. She gives her some what I think is soup, and she's not an authority figure, so I don't understand why she's allowed to do this. I just thought that was a little bit weird. Now she is the daughter of the leader of the cult, so that might have something to do with it. But in my opinion, it feels a little weird, like she's undermining his authority because this girl is meant to be ridiculed. Another issue I have is the random fighting from Thomas. There's a couple of scenes in the movie where he just randomly gets up and starts kicking ass. And it doesn't look bad. The choreography for the fighting is good. There's not very much of it all. It's maybe two little tiny scenes, but it just comes out of nowhere and it doesn't really fit in the movie. I mean, this is a horror movie after all, so it just seems a little weird for there to be some actual fighting, whereas normally you're not, with someone who's got some type of fighting skills like that. However, given his past, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that he has some type of fighting training. Lastly, I would have liked to have heard a little bit more about the main enemy of the movie. She's such a big part of the movie, and yet there's not much said about her. There's not much said about the origin, about where she came from, or where her powers come from. She's just kind of there, and I really think that they should have explored that a little bit more. This movie was just over 2 hours long, so they definitely had some time if they wanted to go more into that. They didn't, and that's fine, but I would have liked to have seen more. This movie is a huge success in the horror genre. It's a little on the art horror side, especially when you consider it runs over 2 hours long, when many modern horror movies are around 80 to 100 minutes. This one sits at a solid 129 minutes. It also doesn't move incredibly fast, but I think that the pacing is done very well. It sets the stage early on for what kind of movie it's going to be, and you know things are about to get weird, but it doesn't get too weird and it doesn't go too far out there. There are a few really gnarly scenes with a lot of blood and gore, and it's overall just not some good things happening. So if you're not a fan of that kind of stuff, I would be very careful, but I still think this movie is worth watching because that's not the point of the film. It's a fantastic movie if you give it the chance. It won't disappoint. Again though, if you're a fan of The Witch, you'll definitely be a fan of The Apostle. I've given this movie my rating of 8 out of 10. I would definitely say this is a movie, well, it's Netflix, so you're gonna have to stream it. That's pretty much the only way you're gonna watch it. So that's it. Yep. See ya.